Okay, hello guys, and welcome to the first panel session of the day here of the NGI Summit. We'll be discussing preserving trust, journalism, and the public sphere, as Ikenna has just said. Now, I've been introduced, but I'll introduce myself again. So my name's Lucy Hedges. I'm the technology editor for the Metro newspaper in the UK. I'm also a presenter for the BBC Travel Show, so really happy to be here and be the chairperson for this panel discussion. Now, you have probably all heard the saying that trust is the currency of the digital age. And as more disruptive technologies, infiltrate our lives, it is challenging that trust. It's making us more cynical and maybe even preventing us from trusting at all. And now the quality of truth in journalism is all under question more than ever. And people are more suspicious of news media. And that is what this session is all about. As Ikenna said, this is a relevant and very, very timely theme. Now, I hope you're all sitting comfortably, because over the next hour, we'll be examining the future of journalism and what Europe can do to avert the continued erosion of public trust in the digital space. So on that note, I would like to introduce my panelists. So we've got Rasmus, Kleis, Nielsen, the director from Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. We have Anna-Sophie Harling, managing director for NewsGuard in Europe, and Geert-Jan Bogaerts from vPro and PublicSpaces. Now, this is a panel discussion, so we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So it goes without saying, we'd love to hear from you guys watching. So if any questions spring to mind throughout the duration of the session, or perhaps you've got a burning question right now that you'd like to throw at our panelists, we'd love to hear them, and I'm sure our panelists would love to answer them. Now, just to bring you up to speed on how this session is going to run, I'm going to have a little one-on-one conversation with each of our panelists first, and then we'll open up to a short panel discussion and then audience questions. I think it makes sense that I go in the order that I introduced you. So, Rasmus, hello. How's it going?
Hello, Lucy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, thankfully. So thank you for joining me. So let's start by talking generally about your thoughts on trust in news. It's a massive talking point right now. So let's start by talking about what you think about trust in news.
Well, Lucy, I think you said it. Trust is the cornerstone of journalism and its role in society, increasingly so going forward. It's the basis both of the public impact that journalism can have when it connects with an audience, but also increasingly for the business of private sector news organizations, and of course for the legitimacy of public service media like the BBC. Without trust, it's hard to see that journalism can play the role that it tries to play in our democracies. And without trust, it's also hard to see how the business of news can survive, or how organizations like public service media can remain legitimate in the eyes of the citizens who ultimately fund them.
And do you think, let's talk about the impact that internet platforms have had on local political and public interest journalism. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think there are a lot of different things going on at the same time, and the impact that's felt most keenly by news media themselves, of course, is the business impact. Historically, advertising largely went to media organizations, including news media organizations, and was a very large share, half or often more, of the revenues that funded investment in professional journalism. In the digital space, a very large share of this advertising in many countries, the majority, go to just a few large US-based technology companies, most notably Google and Facebook. And this, of course, is an immense challenge for the business of news as we knew it. And felt very keenly by news media across Europe, who are losing revenues and having to lay off staff, as they sometimes find it quite difficult to find new and sustainable models in a digital media environment. There are also other impacts beyond this. It's clear that as we in the public have embraced digital media and also embraced various platforms, whatever reservations we also might have about how they operate and how they collect data and the like, large platforms such as search engines and social media are more and more central to how many people, in particular younger people, get their news. And from the point of view of news organizations, the risk is that you become disintermediated and you become content suppliers to large platforms and lose the direct connection with the audience. Of course, the risk of turning away is that you lose access to that audience altogether, because many people, in particular young people, rarely go directly to news media online for their news and much more rely on search engines, social media, messaging applications, and video sharing sites for accessing news. So in that sense, a big challenge around the business in particular. But around audiences, quite a complex picture. On the one hand, there is the risk of becoming reliant on these large platforms, but there is also the opportunity to reach audiences that aren't otherwise going directly to news providers. And these audiences are very often younger people, people with low levels of formal education, people with lower levels of income that news media often struggle to reach, and that historically have been quite underserved by many of the established media. So quite a mixed picture in terms of the impact of the platforms.
Yeah, and you're so right. It's so multifaceted. There are so many different platforms where people can get news from. It really is it's kind of a minefield, really, of information. And so it's really important to have this regulation and to have, that trust built into these platforms. So do you think regulating platforms retroactively can fix this media landscape?
I mean, I think it's clear that, as with many media historically, we've seen the same with broadcasting in many countries historically. The growth of the platforms in part reflect a policy vacuum where existing regulations didn't fully capture all the different aspects of their business models and their operations, and technology and user behavior forged ahead much faster than regulation and oversight evolved. So I think there is a very real gap here, and I'm glad that policymakers in many countries are looking at this. I think it's clear we're going to see action in the competition space. The Crimea report to the Commission outlines some recommendations. It's very clear that Commissioner Vestager is rightly looking at this. I think it's also clear we have more work to do around data protection and privacy, where GDPR and the EU Privacy Directive were steps, but I think there is arguably more to be done in that space too. And then finally, of course, there is a whole area of what oversights and transparency and accountability looks like in a media environment, where often it's very hard for outsiders, including regulators and policymakers, to really understand how information moves on large private, proprietary, for-profit platforms, what the impacts are, and what, if any, further oversight, regulation, or other interventions might be necessary to minimize the risks and harms that these businesses can produce, while ensuring that all of us as users have opportunities that we make use of and benefit us. Now, in terms of news specifically, I mean, this is essentially a political question, but I suppose my personal sense is that it's quite unlikely that these regulatory or policy interventions will make all that much of a difference for news and journalism specifically. The challenges that news and journalism face are in part about these issues, but not centrally, I would say. I think a lot of it is about the challenges of the business model, and also the way in which journalism is often sort of left out of wider regulations of speech online, for example, and not really treated as a distinct category of speech. And in that sense, what's going to happen next essentially is a political question. And it's up to the elected officials who represent the people of Europe to offer their views of what they think can be done from a regulatory point of view to create a more enabling environment for journalism. There are many demonstrated tools available, and it's a question of choices and priorities, whether they are used. This includes support for public service media and, of course, opportunity for supporting nonprofit media and private sector media. And it's essentially a political choice whether we do it or not. The budget of the European Union is about 160 billion euros a year, and the combined spend of the EU member states is something like 7 trillion euros. Right now, almost none of that money goes to support independent professional journalism. We have seen many big bailout packages and support schemes launched during the pandemic and the COVID crisis. Again, almost none of them include any kind of support for journalism. It's a political question whether we want this. I personally think the case is clear that there is market failure in several areas. We could do something. There are models available. I don't detect great political appetite or support for spending taxpayer money on supporting journalism. And frankly, I suppose I do understand, if you're a politician, would you really want to go door to door and knock on doors and ask people, what do you want, more nurses or more journalists, or higher taxes and more journalists? Or will you perhaps decide that giving an after-dinner speech once in a while about the importance of journalism but not really doing anything much to help it is a safer course of action from a sort of pragmatic point of view as a politician?
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note then, do you think there are reasons to be hopeful about the future of journalism in the digital age?
I mean, I think we can't sugarcoat the challenges. They're very real. We have increased information inequality. We have very severe threats to the historic business of journalism, and we have a whole slew of problems around misinformation, hate speech, and the like online, sometimes amplified and enabled by the business models and technical systems of large platform companies that so far have been subject to quite uneven regulatory oversight and the like. So I think the challenges are very real. But I would also say that when it comes to news and journalism, even though there are clearly many losers, underprivileged communities who are not being served as they should be and not being represented the way they should be in the news, as well as local communities who are losing their historic newspapers and the like as the business is challenged, I remain a cautious optimist, I would say. I mean, I think we are seeing some really impressive and important new journalism being done that is wholly native to a digital environment, that plays an important role in society, it holds power to account, help people remain informed, and also creates a sustainable business around this. El Diario in Spain is a digital-born news site that does this very successfully. Initiator is an old historic newspaper in Sweden that's adapted very successfully to a digital environment. We see non-profit media like Correctiv in Germany and fact-checking outfits of various sorts across Europe and beyond that are doing really, really important, innovative digital journalism in a sustainable fashion. So there are very real challenges, and I think we're going to see a lot of news organizations continue to cut costs and cut their newsrooms. Some will close. But I'll also say I think we're seeing some really impressive digital journalism, both from old media and from new media entering the market across Europe, and we can learn from that, and I think we can take hope and lessons from their work.
Oh, what a shame. Oh, what a shame. We've lost Lucy temporarily there, but thank you very much for those points, Rasmus. I was particularly interested in when it comes to investigative journalism. What is it? What can convince the public that that is something that we should just pay for? I mean, we all seem to love the reports, the exposés when they come out, but it's something that a lot of news organizations struggle to fund.
I mean, I think first of all, I think we should recognize that we are increasingly seeing that people are paying for some of the most impressive journalism. And what I hear from editors and executives at news media across Europe is that the things that encourage people to sign up as subscribers or as members in the case of nonprofit organizations is very often investigations. It's original, distinct, valuable journalism that stands out from the backdrops of churn of just mediocre stuff and sometimes misinformation online. So I think we should recognize that investigative journalism may be more central to the business success of journalism than it's ever been, where it's always been sort of a loss center, if you will, and sort of an expensive luxury and never really very central to a business that was about mass audience and advertising. But in the future, it may well be. In a way, I think the challenge around investigations is more that of course, that there are many areas that are poor or marginalized in various ways and are not getting the attention that I think they merit. I think there are many parts of Europe that are sadly undercovered in this way, including in rich countries, where a lot of investigations tend to focus on the metropolitan center. But more broadly, I think the issue we face around this is not only those of us who might join an event like this, who may well love investigations and really read it, but from the point of view of the mass public, the majority of people who aren't really seeking this stuff out, for journalists to better understand why is it that the things that journalists and sort of news lovers all agree are really important and interesting and valuable often seem to have so little appeal to millions and millions of people across the world who we think would benefit from it, but seem to sort of regard with indifference or even hostility much of what we do. I think there is a real challenge around the public connection that journalism is premised on, and that Lucy also raised in her important point about trust from the outset of this conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Rasmus. And to continue talking about the public connection, I'd like to move to Anna-Sophie, who's the managing director of NewsGuard Europe. Anna-Sophie, one of the most contentious aspects of journalism right now is, of course, fake news. I guess the pill, the antidote to that is fact-checking. but do people then believe the fact checkers? Tell us, what is the future of fact checking? Ooh. Can't hear you at the moment. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I think I was on
gotcha,
mute.
mute.
There we go.
The first hurdle. Okay, go.
Classic mistake. Rasmus pointed to this earlier, but we're seeing quite an interesting trend where fact-checking with organizations like Correctiv in Germany and Full Fact in the UK, for example, are taking on quite important roles, not just as fact-checkers, but as doing really important, hard-hitting journalism. And through their collaborations with tech platforms, we're actually seeing those investigations and reports being inserted in places where we might be, or users might be encountering fake news. So the typical way that would happen is, say you're on Instagram or Facebook, and Facebook has identified a false claim or image or post. There might be a little flag, a screen that says this has been fact checked by certain fact checkers, and the users can read this. Now, of course, the question is, how effective is this? We get all the time from users that say, "Oh, if a fact checker has found this as being false, that must mean that it's doubly true, and it's really important that we believe what it said, because mainstream media and big tech platforms are trying to quash the message." So, I think ultimately, and this is what we've seen through COVID as well, is that more and more the trust in institutions, whether it's traditional media outlets or up and coming outlets that are run by real journalists, are being questioned, and so-called either anonymous individuals or bloggers who don't have credentials and who might call themselves experts are able to shape narratives and convince people of untruths. And so that's the big question: is how do we reinforce trust in credible institutions, in credible journalism, and what role do fact checkers have to play there? And I think that's definitely up in the air.
Anna-Sophie, I think we need to swap positions, because that was exactly the next question that I wanted to ask. What are the concrete things to rebuild, the concrete steps that can be taken to rebuild that trust? But before you answer, I'm pleased to say that Lucy's back online, so she's going to step back into my shoes, and hopefully, Anna-Sophie, if you can continue giving an answer to the question you yourself actually posed. What are the concrete steps that people can take to rebuild trust in journalistic institutions? That'd be good.
Sure. So I think I might be a bit biased because I work for an organization that uses what we call human intelligence to bring transparency to the media landscape online. But I think that transparency can go quite a long way in reinforcing trust. When we give individual internet users information about who is behind certain websites or accounts, how are they getting their money, what is their financial backing? Are they being motivated by advertising spend, or are they selling certain hoax products? Do they have a corrections policy? What even is a corrections policy, and why is that important? Does the website have misleading headlines? These are the kinds of things where it really helps to empower users by giving them information about sources should they want it, right? So the idea is not necessarily to block or take anything down, but to give people the sense that they have the information they need in order to make educated choices about what they want to read and share and like and trust.
I think you make a really valid point, and transparency does go such a long way to instilling that trust. And I think this is the massive hurdle, obviously, that we're all facing at the moment. So just finally, are there any lessons then that we can learn from the rise in misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic?
So I would say personally, what I have seen that is concerning, and that's something that we should really be working on in the future, is the fact that social media has allowed for, I guess the classic term is filter bubbles, but it allows users to create an ecosystem where they receive the same types of information, whether it's true or false, or from certain political, leanings, and that certain social media platforms will actually point users in more and more extreme content and reinforce, certain false beliefs. And I think that's one of the most insidious things that we've seen, especially during COVID. It's shown that, there are real world harms when people believe false information and don't take certain steps to, protect their families. They decide not to wear masks because they think that causes cancer. They, won't take a vaccine because they think it causes autism. There are certain narratives that might not just hurt individuals and families, but society as a whole. And when social media, encourages users who join, one anti-vax group to join 5 more, it's entirely believable and understandable that, when you log onto a social media page and you are bombarded with, misleading and false and often dangerous messages, that it does create an alternate reality, which is entirely different than the traditional experience of walking into a newsstand and being confronted by, different types of headlines, but ones that, do have credible journalism behind them and some sort of safety mechanism.
I think the spread of misinformation on social media is something that, so many big brands have tried to really stem, but it's still something that's bordering out of control. And I think there's a lot of people who, they can't differentiate between credible news and, misinformation. And it's like you say, it's dangerous and it's insidious. So Anna-Sophie, thank you so much for sharing your views. Geert-Jan, I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you.
Hello. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so what we want to know is a bit more about your views on the internet as a public space. So how can we work to promote public interest, shared values and common goods in an internet that often seems designed to encourage conflict and tribalism? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one of our main observations should be that the internet as we know it, you can liken it to a huge tree that's mostly above ground and that provides a lot of the functionality that we've come to depend upon. However, the roots of the tree are all dominated by private companies, mainly out of Silicon Valley, that do not necessarily have the public interest at heart. On the contrary, most of these companies, they care about one thing only, which is shareholder value. And I think in order to really get, so to say, at the root of the problem, we really need to think about the kind of functionalities that we feel are so important from a public perspective, from the point of view of public service, that you also need to think about setting up some kind of alternative to whatever the services are that are so important to us, to our daily lives. Would it be possible, for instance, to move from using Google Maps to something like OpenMap? Would it be possible to swap a Facebook or a Google login system, authentication system, with something like OpenID or, for instance, an initiative that has been developed within the Netherlands, IRMA. So there are lots of different categories that I think are not built from the point of view of what really serves the public interest, and that we should take a long and hard look at. You can perhaps compare them to like public utilities that have been brought under some kind of public control over the last century. They are of such importance to the functioning of our society that as a society we felt it's necessary that they become more publicly accountable in the end.
So an alternative model. So given that, that we're talking about trust here, if we, let's say hypothetically, we were able to achieve this and move to different platforms and models, how do you think, what are some of the challenges then in getting public trust in those platforms and being able to shift onto something new? How do you work around that?
I think the shift to something new really should be something that's like a faraway goal. I mean, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to get there, but there are steps we can take in the meantime. For instance, at this moment, our PublicSpaces coalition, which consists of about 20 parties in the Netherlands and outside of the Netherlands, is working on a concept called proof of provenance. Proof of provenance is really some kind of certificate that allows for full transparency on both the identity and the nature of the creator of content, but also whatever happened to that content in its entire distribution chain. So you could compare that to some kind of certificate that's clickable and that would allow the end user to completely follow the chain of origin of that particular piece of content. We're also working on other kinds of authentication system and collaboration systems. So we take it piecemeal, we take it step by step. We are identifying within our own digital environments the kind of components that are fit to be replaced by mainly open source components, and in the end, provide the public with these alternatives, so we can make them more accessible, more usable, more popular in the end.
Yeah, so ultimately it's about giving the public choice and putting the control into their hands to make them feel a bit more confident about the services and platforms they're accessing.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that as the other side of the coin. I mean, while Rasmus was talking rightfully so about regulation and taxation, I think those are very important steps that we need to take on the European level. We also need to think about this and to approach this problem from the other side, from the bottom up, so to speak, thinking about alternatives, building them and leveraging what's already been done, by the way, on a tremendous scale in the open source community.
So then what is the role of cultural institutions and public service broadcasters in shaping the future of the internet? What role do they have?
I see it mainly as a question of reach. I mean, only in the Netherlands alone, the PublicSpaces coalition reaches about 70 to 75% of the entire population of the Netherlands. So we can, by adopting these alternatives ourselves, we can get a kind of outreach out there that's hard to parallel if you're starting from scratch or having to build something from the ground up. Also, we have some kind of knowledge, a basic knowledge about storytelling, about building narratives, about framing issues, about reaching audiences, but also engaging with them in a conversation and building a kind of common knowledge, both as cultural institutions, but also as public broadcasters.
Yeah. And finally, just one last question for you. How would you envision more pan-European cooperation to strengthen the digital public sphere?
I think in the end, this can only be achieved by a European corporation. So at the moment, we are engaged in discussions that we have on a fairly regular basis with parties from Britain, Italy, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Poland. I'm sure I'm missing a couple of countries there. And we are addressing exactly this. And we see this as something that, we should capitalize on national movements and national discussions that are already taking place and try to scale up whatever is happening on a national level by exchanging best practices, by seeing how we can learn from each other, and by bringing all these lessons in the end to a kind of political level, so that this becomes a topic of debate within the European Commission, within the European Parliament. Stop talking about just building a single digital European market, and really trying to build a single digital European culture or society.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful stuff, Geert-Jan. Thank you so much. So we're now about 20 minutes left of our panel discussion. So I'm now going to open the discussion up to all of our panelists with some audience questions and some questions that I've got here for you guys as well. So I think I'm going to fire straight ahead with this question we've got from one of our audience members. Isn't it wise not to separate digital from physical media, but to find a medium that combines and strengthens of both and avoids the weaknesses of both? What do you guys think about that? That's Sophie, what do you think? Hello?
Sorry, me?
Yes. What do you think?
Sorry. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question.
So isn't it basically we shouldn't be separating the digital and the physical media. We should be finding a kind of fair playing ground, a medium that strengthens both platforms and avoids the weaknesses of both. So combining the two rather than treating them as two separate mediums.
Well, I mean, I guess many of the greatest journalism outlets do combine both. In that, they have a physical print paper, but then they also take advantage of numerous different digital outlets, as Rasmus said, to reach different audiences of different ages and backgrounds and geographic locations. And I think that there's great value in this. There's also great value in, digital-only outlets as well, who, can't afford to produce a daily print paper or find that, the digital medium is the most effective way of relaying their journalism. I would say when it comes to NewsGuard and the way that we operate, when we produce our ratings for news outlets, we heavily examine the amount of, or I guess the content that you might find on that website. But of course, in order to gauge the credibility of the outlet, we engage with and we speak to the reporters who work on the ground within the newsroom. And we'll, of course, take into account any content that they might produce, physically. But ultimately, when it comes to helping empower users online, it's important to understand that, the average user might not know the veracity of the information that they're receiving, who's behind it. You do want to create, a fair playing ground for all journalists online. But ultimately, it is important that users understand the difference between, a credible newsroom that has 400 journalists and someone who sits in a basement just, spouting false information in order to make money off of it online.
Yeah, I think sometimes, though, it can be quite difficult to identify, for some people, identify a platform that, like you say, has a room full of 400 credible journalists and someone who's just, sat in their bedroom, bashing out news. I think, and it sometimes can be quite difficult for people to ascertain that which information is credible. So I think that's the real challenge here for platforms to be able to stand head and shoulders above the best. But how do they do that? How do they put it out there that they are the credible source versus someone who isn't?
Well, I guess not to make a big pitch for NewsGuard, but that's, the kind of work that we do, which is to produce what we call nutrition labels for news websites, and then work with social media platforms to help empower users. We produce a browser extension which people can download so that when they're scrolling through a social media feed or a search result, they'll be able to read more about who's behind the websites that they're seeing. And there are loads of other, great organizations that are doing similar types of work. But ultimately, the question is the extent to which, the big tech platforms will engage with smaller organizations like ours, the extent to which they might want to build solutions in-house. And we're already seeing that as well. But yeah, I guess, it's a question as well for the audience, right? When it comes to fighting fake news and deciding, which organizations to trust and which not, is it social media's responsibility? Should government step in? What role do journalists play? Is it up to, the NewsGuards and fact-checking organizations of the world? I guess that definitely remains to be seen.
Yeah. And what future developments would you say you're most worried about? For example, deep fakes. What's going to make things worse?
From a personal point of view, I think the rise of certain online narratives, I'm thinking specifically of QAnon and the spread to Europe from the US and the role that social media plays. That to me is one of the more worrying trends because it is a kind of meta conspiracy that seeks to undermine trust in essentially every credible institution that exists. And once that trust has been lost, the big question is, how do you win it back?
Yeah. Well, Rasmus and Geert, do you have any thoughts on that? What future developments are you most worried about? Rasmus?
Sure. I mean, I think that the remarks that have been made, I think, illustrate the complexities that we face. And I guess what I'm probably most worried about is that either for-profit companies or policymakers refuse to recognize the complexities of these challenges. It's, I think, very easy in the abstract in a conversation like this to agree that false and harmful information is a problem. But it's also a problem to agree who gets to decide what exactly is false and what exactly is harmful, and recognizing that the fundamental right to free speech that's protected by the European Union's founding documents also covers statements that are disturbing, offensive, and shocking, and not necessarily true. Given that a lot of misinformation fundamentally is legal speech, who gets to decide when a private for-profit company are allowed or even encouraged to remove it at scale, in particular around controversial issues, or when a judge, or even worse, the executive, or even potentially more problematic, gets to remove these things. You know, my personal definition of what's false and harmful as a citizen may not be the same as some elected officials, for example, or for that matter, the same as a private entity like NewsGuard. I mean, I can't help but note that NewsGuard rates Fox News as a website that generally maintains basic standards of credibility and transparency, though it does note with significant exceptions. I think the significant exceptions there are important, and I'm also glad that while I don't personally think Fox News is necessarily my first choice as a source of trustworthy information about public affairs, that we don't live in a world in which governments or private companies can just unilaterally decide to sort of scrub it from the internet. So I think we need to contend with the fact that different people have very different values, very different perspectives, and they often disagree very fundamentally about important issues, including this idea that Europe should be a single culture or society. I can think about a couple of 100 million Europeans who may not have much sympathy with that idea. And if we don't recognize that political complexity, but rush ahead into either commercial solutions that are driven by the for-profit interests of the companies behind many of these platforms, or for that matter, sort of politicians who may be tempted to pretend that complex problems are in fact simple, and then rush in to limit speech in ways that I think could potentially be quite harmful for free expression, in particular for marginalized groups who are often singled out as potential terrorists or in other ways demonized and by many establishment politicians. And I think that's quite worrying. And I think these are very real issues that we face across Europe, where we need to remember that some governments are not democratic and don't respect fundamental rights. And I think would be very pleased if they were given new tools to try to control the citizens who are unlucky enough to be saddled with these governments.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think, what can Europe do then to avert the continued erosion of public trust in the digital sphere, or is it worth even trying?
No, it's not working fine. I mean, but we're in a terrible situation in many ways, but things can always get worse. And I think it's really quite dangerous if we, are naive enough to move from forgetting that private companies have for-profit motives to forgetting that politicians have motives as well, and not all of those motives are necessarily ones we agree with individually, and some of those motives are even things we might think of as malign and a threat to journalism and to free speech. I think things can get better. I've tried to outline in my work some of the options that are on the table. I think it's important that we look for things that have broad-based and diverse political support. I don't think we need to have an even higher level of polarization and delegitimization of shared infrastructures, whether they are public or private, the kinds of attacks and allegations, unfounded allegations of bias and the like that are trotted out by some. So I think it's important we have sort of broad-based and diverse support for the collectively binding decisions we take in this space. I think it's important that those decisions are based on better evidence, and there I think it is absolutely necessary that policymakers take steps to ensure that there is far tighter oversight and far greater access to data in a privacy-compliant fashion so that independent researchers, fact-checkers, and others can really understand what happens in these infrastructures that we're also reliant on. And then, I happen to believe as a citizen, but also as a researcher, think the evidence is very strong that independent professional journalism matters. And if we believe that, then I think there is a case for investment of public resource in some combination of nonprofit, private sector, and public service media. That's a question of political priorities of what we want to spend our money on. And right now, even if I personally think that the case is very strong and that journalism merits public support, I will only say I don't think we have a lot of sort of evidence to suggest that politicians across Europe are jumping up and down, eager to invest taxpayer money or public resources in supporting journalism. And I think we just need to confront that. We are on our own. It's up to the public and to journalism and the news media to find a way through this crisis and to be appropriately skeptical, certainly of platform companies who have their motives, but also of politicians who have their own motives too.
Yeah, absolutely. Geert-Jan, I've got a question for you. So how do we address the change in channels through which citizens receive information about politics, health, and the environment?
Get that. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, of course. How do we address the change in channels through which citizens receive information about politics, health, and the environment?
I think the key here, and I kind of agree with what previous speakers have said, the key here is transparency. You might also advocate even some kind of enforced transparency in the sense that once people have an absolute right to know what the origins of any kind of information is that reaches them, whether it be related to health or whether it be related to politics or political choices that need to be made. People need to be able to find out in a very straightforward and as accessible manner as possible that information originates from any foreign country, from Russia or North Korea or whatever. If an information comes from bloggers that have a certain reputation to uphold, whether it's from official media, the last thing you want to do is restrict the access to the internet or restrict the free speech that the internet has made so widely available to everybody. I mean that's a treasure that we need to keep. But we also need to safeguard that people know the kind of information that they're having and what these sources are. And I also see a role for education there, what we call like media savviness. Know how you how you use media, what kind of media there are. Be able to distinguish satire and irony from fact, being able to separate fact from opinion, very basic capabilities like that are perhaps too often still overlooked, and they are crucial, in my opinion, to fight some of the phenomena that we've been discussing today.
Okay, so talking about global action, must we take action on a global scale, and if so, what should we do? I'm going to put that question to Rasmus.
I think the sort of realities of global geopolitics are very clear right now. Both China and the United States and the European Union as a whole see media and technology policy and media and technology businesses as part of their geopolitical interests. And I think we're being naive if we don't recognize that there is a very clear political and sort of state angle to some of the discussions that exist around media policy and digital regulation right now. That means, from my point of view, that while it is important to have some very basic, bare minimum agreements that have enabled the internet with all its many imperfections to evolve, and also perhaps a sort of a as happens in the Internet Governance Forum and other places, as space for a global debate about this. I think there is a risk that we may have to settle for a very lowest common denominator, and even one that comes with quite a fundamental threat to basic human rights, if it's a global consensus that requires Russia, mainland China, India, the United States, whoever happens to be sitting in the White House, but certainly under the current occupant, as well as a European Union where several governments are demonstrably not respectful of fundamental rights to democracy, to all agree on a single global blueprint. I mean, these things are nice to imagine, and it would be wonderful if something benign happened, but I have to say, if we hold our breath waiting for a global compact on the future of digital technology and the internet, I think we'll turn blue in the face before something happens.
Yeah, I think you're not wrong there. Guys, do you have anything to add to what Rasmus has just said? Geert-Jan?
I think that Europe is in a kind of unique position to play a role here because we have a tradition of providing public services by institutions that have a legally guaranteed autonomy, so to speak. So I think we can strive a balance there between, on the one hand, the complete state-controlled, internet functionalities that are provided in some of the more authoritarian countries in Eastern Asia, and the complete free-for-all approach that's being advocated by the Americans. And I agree with Rasmus that you can wait till the end of time till you reach some kind of global agreement on this. But I think Europe as a whole is large enough to make a difference, at least for the EU member states and for Europe as a whole. And whether or not that's going to be in the end a model that can be spread more globally, that remains to be seen. But I wouldn't wait for it. I would start out in Europe and at least engage in building some kind of European digital platform that we at least are comfortable with.
Yeah. So there's still a lot of building blocks to be made, a lot of work to be done, but we've got the right direction, where it should be started. And on that note, that brings us to the end of our session. That went really quickly. I want to thank my panelists, Geert-Jan, Rasmus and Anna-Sophie, for giving us their insight into what is quite a really important subject at the moment. I'd also like to thank Nesta and the City of Amsterdam for arranging such a brilliant programme for the NGI Policy Summit. I hope these guys were giving you something to go home and think about. And on that note, I'm going to hand back over to Ikenna for the rest of the programme.